When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject, clean room. User, Alt-Rippeth. Posted, November 28, 1994.
5 years ago, a variant of the Ebola virus was discovered in imported monkeys in Reston, Virginia. The strain wasn't able to cross the species barrier, meaning human lives weren't really in danger. Though, that didn't stop national media from going crazy for the story. There was even a pretty good book written about it, which did a little hypothesizing about what might have happened if it had gone the other way. Thing is, even if it had, Ebola isn't like the cold or flu virus. It's hard to transmit, requiring contact with infected fluid or mucous membranes. It's not that the virus isn't dangerous, because it is. Once you get it, you're pretty well fucked. It's just that it's a known quantity, containable with the proper quarantine procedures. Now, this begs the question, what about a virus that's an unknown quantity? So unknown, in fact, it would be impossible to protect against. Such a virus would be an invaluable weapon for bringing foreign populations and their governments to heel, wouldn't it? The lab at 170 Kent, where I worked until the Pickford variant broke containment in 1964, was built to produce such viruses. A hospital, at least on the surface, set on the edge of an isolated reservation desperately in need of health care. That was the Trojan horse they used to get in, providing for people in need on the surface, while 5 floors below, we were shaking hands with the devil. Right from the start, Pickford was our most promising strain. It started life as a fungus, not far removed from one discovered in 1859 known to zombify ants. Our job was to modify it for use on our enemies. After all, killing people might be a useful tool for breaking governments, but it's messy and obvious. What if we could program a population for compliance instead? We named it Pickford after the silent film star Mary Pickford, mostly because Lars, one of the senior members on our team, was a huge fan of Hollywood's golden era. When we later found out that Pickford had been baptized in quarantine, it was just another happy coincidence in a long line of them. For instance, in their early stages of development, the spores were highly sensitive to their environment and had to be kept between a certain temperature range. There was a 7-day period during the summer of that year where our lab suffered a series of cascading power failures that compromised the refrigeration system's integrity, killing everything kept in there, except for Pickford. Instead of killing it off, the thermal fluctuations seemed to induce a completely unexpected growth pattern in the Pickford spores. They thrived, mutated by chaos in ways we didn't even think were possible, and before you write this off to sheer coincidence, which it could have been had it only happened once, remember there were 7 nights of blackouts, 7 nights of randomized temperature variation, which somehow brought about exactly the right conditions for Pickford to leapfrog every other project at 170 Kent and become our sole focus. It accelerated what should have been a decade-long development process to having animal trials in less than a year. And the trials, oh God, they were a dream. From their very first inhalation of the spores, not a single animal could resist Pickford. Initially, their joints would stiffen as if being electrocuted, then a smile would break out over their face. Even the rats looked beatific, like tiny saints preparing for their eternal reward. When the sclera and pupils darkened to black tendrils of fungus growing into place to cover the entire structure, you knew they were under your spell. From there, they could be trained to do anything with a series of rising tones we came to call the Chatterton Octet, after an engineer who claimed to have heard them in a dream. Another happy accident on Pickford's winding path into existence. Even at the project's accelerated pace, human trials shouldn't have happened for at least another 2 years. The fungus had other ideas. Before I go any further, you need to understand a little about how animal trials functioned at the lab. The area where we worked on the various agents was a glass-walled and airlocked room we called the bubble. Next to the bubble was the clean room, a slightly smaller space where actual testing occurred. The clean room was set up with negative air pressure, meaning the air was continually being pumped in such a way as to form a natural barrier and minimize any chances of particles escaping. It was connected to the bubble by a small airlocked pass-through measuring roughly 2 feet by 2 feet. How it would work on testing days was that the bubble was totally cleared of all but one tech. They would take the agent being tested from the vault and place the container into the pass-through. They would then seal the airlock from their side, tripping an electronic switch to open the other side in the clean room. Once this was done, the same process would be repeated on the opposite wall with the test subject. After the clueless 4-legged creature toddled past the airlock, it too was sealed inside. Then, one of the observers watching through the bubble's walls would trigger the container's remote opening mechanism, unleashing the pathogen into the clean room to do what we built it to do. That's how it all worked, until the day it didn't. Even now, years later, I find myself wondering if Ben Little had any inkling he was going to die that morning. Maybe a heaviness in the pit of his stomach, something he passed off as the residue of a nightmare he couldn't remember. Did he notice anything different when he walked into the bubble for the last time? Were his hands trembling more than usual as he carefully removed the gleaming steel Pickford container from the vault? If he did, he never let on. When did Ben finally understand he was no longer in control? Was it when the first airlock failed to seal, opening a direct path between him and the clean room? When he felt a breeze through the opening, the circulation system having somehow jumped its failsafe, creating a positive pressure environment, forcing air back into the lab? Or did he think he was safe right up until the final tumbler dropped into place and the remote release on Pickford's containment vessel somehow triggered itself, sending a flow of spores directly into his face? Those of us watching couldn't see the spores themselves, of course, but There was no mistaking what happened next. Ben's joints stiffening until one or more of his bones snapped with a wet crack. Even as his lips spread in a wild jester smile so wide his mouth tore at the sides, blood dribbling down over his jawline. Jerking and twitching as if being puppeted by a particularly cruel marionette, he turned toward the observation area, where we were all watching in mute horror. This same horror was reflected in Ben's helpless eyes as they were swarmed with black dots, the fungus spreading faster than it had in any of our test subjects. It was as if the human body were its ideal growth medium, this union, the very thing every rogue temperature fluctuation, mutation, and inexplicable electronic failure had been driving toward. As nightmarish as it was, there were protocols in place for events such as this, except for the life of me, I couldn't remember a single one. All I could do was watch Ben's face ripple as thick knots of something fibrous and quivering slid back and forth just under the epidermis, distending the skin of his face as if it were a silicone mask. Those masses pulsed their way into his neck, engorging it to 2 and then 3 times its size. From behind me, I could hear the lab supervisor, Todd Roth, talking fast and low, as if into a telephone. It was impossible to make out the specifics of what was being said because, in front of us, Ben was racked by a series of convulsions, each accompanied by rancid retching so high-pitched it seemed to drill into my eardrums. How long this went on for, I don't know. All I do know is that it ended with one last full-body spasm, his upper half lurching forward to allow his swollen throat to disgorge ragged stalks of black fungus directly toward us. More than a dozen tendrils punched into the glass wall, each squirming for purchase with its own awful vitality. The observation room was in an uproar. I could hear Todd shouting instructions, telling the techs to leave everything and head for the elevators. From the sounds of rustling paper and squeaking soles on linoleum, they were listening. Me, I couldn't tear my eyes away from the tottering ruin of what used to be Ben Little. Thin filaments of the same material connecting him to the glass were unspooling from beneath his fingernails, wriggling in all directions as if they too craved connection. He seemed to be becoming fuzzy around the edges, obscured by smoke, except there was nothing burning in there. It was then I realized what I was looking at. Not smoke, but spores, pouring out of Ben in a flood. His sickening grin widened, splitting his face further. The tendrils vibrated with disgusting excitement, and a moment later, a voice, low and dry, like the movement of worms in soil, whispered in my ear, "I think I'm going to like it here." Something grabbed my shoulder from behind, and I jumped. It was Todd. His face was pale, drawn. Having snapped back to reality, I realized the deafening alarm klaxon had been blaring this entire time, and even though he was shouting, I could only make out 2 words, mostly by reading his lips. Airstrike. It was enough to get me moving, scrambling to my feet and racing with Todd to the observation room door. It was there I cast one final glance back at the abomination, spreading its black wings in the clean room. Ben's body gave a casual wave before bursting like a dandelion in a spray of dry flesh and spores, waiting to be spread by the wind. For 30 years, I've scoured the news for any indication that Pickford survived. My sleep, when it comes, is troubled and broken. What bothers me most is the persistent question of how it all happened. Was it truly a series of accidents or the will of something beyond my comprehension? I think I'm gonna like it here, it said. What did it know that we didn't? The facility at 170 Kent and the small community it had pretended to care for were incinerated from the air less than an hour later. I'm told that the weapon used was itself another experiment, one which would come to be used for leveling forests in Vietnam. One chimera slayed by another, with no Bellerophon in sight.
Subject, riding shotgun. User, 1CT Wildfay. Posted, September 13th, 1994.
I often find myself thinking back to the time my wife Meryl and I lived on the farm. We weren't farmers, far from it, but for all of her childhood and for years after, her parents were. When it all became too much for them to manage on their own, they sold the livestock and most of their heavy machinery, using the money to buy a little place in town. Because they couldn't stomach the thought of the property being completely empty, we were asked to move in and manage the place. I'd recently gotten out of the service and we weren't exactly sure where we wanted to land, so having a free place to live out in the country was very appealing. Meryl's dad, Carl, died that first year. It happens to guys who work their whole lives and just stop. The same all-smokers I know who quit late in life ended up dying before the ones who kept going. Sometimes you just have to lean in. Meryl's mom, Opal, stayed on in the townhouse by herself almost 5 full years, but she'd been with Carol for 5 times that long, and you could tell she missed him something fierce. We tried inviting her out to the farm more than a few times, but there were always excuses why she couldn't come. So when she finally got sick in the winter of '93 and agreed to stay with us, we knew something was wrong. Christmas was nice, and so was New Year's, but Opal was clearly struggling both physically and mentally. We tried bringing her to Doc Bronson, but he thought it was mostly mental. I think she's throwing in the towel, is how he put it. It was a poetic thought, but neither Meryl or I were convinced, so we made an appointment with a specialist in the city. You know how it is with these things. You always have to wait, so it was agreed Opal would stay with us until the appointment and we'd all decide how to proceed afterward based on the results. Well, it was only a couple days later that she took a turn. Mary hadn't been well herself, so I made sure she was squared away, then checked in on Opal. Her breathing was irregular, but not enough that I thought we needed to take immediate action. She'd had spells before, always following the same pattern, and she always came out okay. I got her a glass of water, said goodnight, and headed off to sleep on the couch. Mary didn't like it when we slept apart, but I'd spent enough time on the boats sleeping next to sick people that I knew it was a bad idea. When either one of us took ill, I slept on the couch. And that night, let me tell you, I slept. Mary came downstairs shortly after I hauled myself up to go to the bathroom and said something to the effect of, "You haven't slept that soundly in a long time." Didn't I know it? Once I got into the bathroom, I closed the door behind me, did my thing, and when I looked in the window, it was someone else's face staring back at me. Well, I suppose you could say it was my face, but a rough 30 to 40 years down the line, with deep-set wrinkles and loose skin and a mouth without a single tooth in it. I started both of my hands gripping the basin in shock. No more than a blink later, and it was all gone. My regular face and busted-up choppers staring back at me. I was trying to make sense of what had happened when Mary called my name, distraught. I pushed whatever had happened out of my mind and followed Mary's voice to the spare room. She was standing next to her mother's still body, sobbing. I took her in my arms and let her get it all out. You can't fight grief, so there's no point in trying. Just ride the waves till they get smaller. After that, there was a quiet period where we straightened up her things a bit before making the necessary phone calls. She was ice cold, if you'll pardon me saying so. So having the paramedics come was more about chain of command than it was medical care. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of paperwork, decisions, and notifying family, and through it all, I had just the strangest feeling. It's a difficult thing to put into words, but the best way I can describe it is that I didn't feel like myself. Again, grief does funny things to you, and Mary was my priority, so I didn't put too much thought into it, but every now and then a thought would rise to the surface that didn't quite feel as if it was mine. It lasted well into the evening, once everything had been done and everyone had gone home. Mary and I were in bed, talking about what had happened and what needed to be done in the morning when all of a sudden I felt what I can only describe as an invisible weight rising off of me. In an instant, I knew it had been Opal, staying with us a while longer to make sure everything was going to be okay. I'm not a religious man, and I've seen some things in this world that make me question the existence of God, but I firmly believe my mother-in-law was riding shotgun the day she died.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.